Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. Have you ever heard of the Green Mountain Boys? Well, they started off as kind of a vigilante group and then turned into a respected military force back in the 1700s in what is today the state of Vermont. So why a Connecticut podcast featuring Vermont? Well, the Green Mountain Boys were started by Connecticut natives Ethan Allen and Seth Warner, and those two are largely responsible for Vermont's very existence, believe it or not. Here to tell us this intriguing story is author and historian Gene Procknow. Gene's a frequent contributor to the Journal of the American Revolution. He's also author of numerous articles on both the Green Mountain Boys and Ethan Allen. He'll be along in just a moment. This week's trivia question: this place features peace and tranquility, probably the freshest jam possible, and one of the best kept mummified body parts in history. Where is it? Well, stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Well, you've undoubtedly heard of Ethan Allen furniture. Maybe you know that U.S. Route 7 in western Connecticut is also called the Ethan Allen Highway. Well, Ethan Allen was born in Litchfield, and his cousin Seth Warner was born in Roxbury. Ethan Allen's the name we tend to remember, but as you're going to hear today, Seth Warner probably deserves equal credit. Together with their cousin, who was named Remember Baker, and Allen's brother Ira Allen, they took their fortunes in the 1700s to the area we today call Vermont. Now, back then, Vermont wasn't even a colony, much less a state, just beautiful wilderness tucked between New Hampshire and New York. Now, New Hampshire and New York were both British colonies, and each had a governor who was loyal to the king. Now, as usually happened with early settlers, people bought land grants and then developed their property into a homestead. And so it was for Ethan Allen and his family. Their land grants were in those vast woodlands that would become Vermont, home of the gorgeous Green Mountains. Well, they didn't realize at the time they were doing this that fate would have them forming the fighting group, the Green Mountain Boys, and that they would then be fighting themselves to ensure the creation of our 14th state of Vermont. Here to tell us this rather incredible story is historian and author Gene Procknow. Gene's an expert on the Green Mountain Boys and Ethan Allen and Seth Warner. He's written numerous articles about it all, and he's a regular contributor to the Journal of the American Revolution. Gene, the issue here that I see with the Green Mountain Boys is that it comes in two parts. There's part one where they were really defending land grants in what we today call Vermont, and then they were later officially part of the Continental Army fighting in the Revolutionary War. And with those two parts are two very prominent people and names we've heard. Ethan Allen, of course, virtually everybody's heard about. Maybe a little less so Seth Warner, but so important as well, and a Roxbury, Connecticut native, and Ethan from Litchfield, and also Remember Baker, who was from the same family, who played a prominent role in getting them into these roles. And you know this whole story, so I'm looking forward to having this chat. Let's just jump right into it. Let's start talking about how did Remember Baker, Ethan Allen, and Seth Warner get from Connecticut up into what we today call Vermont, but back in those days was anything but Vermont?
The connection there is really the Housatonic Valley, which is the river valley in Connecticut that parallels the New York state border. And all three of these leaders were born in that valley. They all were connected. Warner and Allen were cousins of Remember Baker, so that was a strong connection. And even though that weren't born, as you mentioned, in the same locations, they got together for family events and got to know each other. This was emblematic of a lot of New Englanders. As families grew larger and larger, they needed more land to farm, and so they went north and west. This family went up the Housatonic Valley, up through the Berkshires and Massachusetts, and began to explore Vermont. And so that's really how they got together. And it's a story of family, but it's also a story of exploring and pioneering.
Now, explain, if you will, just how Vermont was settled in the early days. So it was undeclared land New Hampshire decided, the British authorities in New Hampshire decided to grant some land to people who would come in and settle it. And the British in New York State weren't so happy about that. Could you kind of summarize what that was all about?
Yes, it was a bit of a clash of cultures and a clash of greed. The greed is that each of the governors of New York and New Hampshire got money to grant land. So if you wanted land, you asked for a land grant and you had to pay for it. And that lined the pockets of the British royal governors. And so each of those governors wanted to grant as much land as they could to make money. So that's the greed aspect. There was also a culture aspect. New Yorkers were a bit more hereditary. They had manorial farms where you had tenants working on the farms. And the people from New Hampshire were the hard scrabble, independent yeoman farmer. And so those two cultures clashed. And then, just imagine yourself, you get a land grant from one of these two governors, and you show up and you put your stakes down, you start clearing your ground, you build a house and a barn, and all of a sudden you find someone coming onto your property that says, no, this is my property. So that became the nub of the issue, is that you had these overlapping claims, and it led to a lot of violence, mostly non-lethal violence, but it would be pretty bad to have your house and barn burned down and your cattle killed by the other side. So it was a pretty vicious type fight between the two. The British king finally came down on the side that this land was part of New York State, the colony of New York at the time, but he left ambiguous what happened to the New Hampshire land grants.
So now you have, and this is early 1770s, I think 1771, Ethan Allen actually has one of these New Hampshire land grants, and I think Remember did as well. I'm not sure about Seth, but either way, they're very upset about the tactics you just laid out, and they come together at this legendary location in Bennington known as Catamount Tavern, and they have some discussions. And what happened after those discussions?
Well, they formed something called the Green Mountain Boys, which was basically a vigilante group to assert the claims of the New Hampshire grantees against New York. And basically, if a New York surveyor came into their territory, they accosted the surveyor and broke his tools and sent him back to New York. They tarred and feathered some people. They burned some barns of New York people, and they did an extra legal activities to secure the rights to their land, or their possession of the land. It was a pretty nasty fight. There's a great story at this tavern that you mentioned, where they had a stuffed catamount, a mountain lion, the Vermont version of a mountain lion. They put the stuffed animal up on a pole. And so what they did is they took a couple of these New Yorkers, and as punishment, hoisted them up on top of the pole and sat them on the catamount and reviled them from afar. So that was the punishment for a New Yorker that would not recognize Vermont land claims.
As you say, the tactics are getting maybe a little bit out of control. And if I did my reading right, not all of the New Hampshire land grant settlers were actually in favor of what Ethan Allen was doing. But before we started recording, I think you made a very important distinction between Ethan Allen and Seth Warner in particular. So Ethan Allen, you say, was more a political agitator, and Seth Warner was more an accomplished military field operator. But Ethan was the guy who was really running the Green Mountain Boys in part one of our story here. And so now he is continuing to do these attacks on New York. And if I have it right, the New York officials sentenced him to death in absentia. Is that right?
They put a price on his head. I think it was 20 pounds. There's a bunch of colorful stories about this. One story is that Ethan Allen walks into a bar in Albany and says, "I'm Ethan Allen. I got a price on my head. Who's going to buy me a drink?" And he brazenly walked out. So whether that's 100% true or not, I don't know. But what is definitely true is that Ethan Allen said, "Okay, you put a price on my head. I'm going to put a price on the governor's head." So they put a price on the governor's head of 15 pounds because he said he wasn't worth as much as me.
I love it. Now, So let's fast forward to 1775, and now we've had these, I guess you call them skirmishes or provocations to keep the New Hampshire land grants with these settlers. And now the Revolutionary War is starting to really take shape. So you've had Lexington and Concord, and and things are really bubbling up. And what happens, and this puts Ethan Allen into the limelight militarily speaking, and I think this is what most people think about him, and they think of him as this military genius because he was there at Fort Ticonderoga. But when you read the history there, it's not like they had a lot of resistance from the British when they went in, right? With Benedict Arnold and crew.
There was a lone sentry. The lone sentry tried to fire his gun and it misfired. There was a flash in the pan, so to speak. So they just kind of walked in the open gate then and captured about 30 British soldiers that were sleeping. So the British had no knowledge of Lexington and Concord. They did not think that there was going to be any trouble, and therefore they were not really on guard. It wasn't a battle at all. It was a pretty intrepid thing to do, and it was a pretty brave thing to do because they didn't know that when you start off. You didn't know there was only one guard. You also were attacking the king, which would be hanging in a fence, being hung, drawn, and quartered. So it was a courageous thing to do, but it wasn't particularly a military feat of any kind. Then they got into the stores of the fort and drank all the liquor. So that was a pretty good end to that battle. Ethan Allen and Seth Warner and Remember Baker and the Green Mountain Boys were pretty sharp characters. They knew the geopolitical situation. They realized that the king wasn't going to recognize their land ownership. And so they said, well, let's try the Continental Congress. They took Ticonderoga, I believe, as evidence of their patriotism and support of the Continental Congress in hopes the Continental Congress would in turn recognize their land grants. There was definitely some self-interest associated with their activities here.
Well, and you point out absolutely accurately, they went down to Philadelphia, they met with the Continental Congress, they wanted their land grants approved, and they also wanted the Green Mountain Boys to become an official paid portion of the Continental Army, correct? What happened there?
Yes, all of the regiments of the Continental Army were state oriented. So, Massachusetts had to raise so many troops, Connecticut had to raise so many troops, and so on for all 13 colonies. However, what they did is they volunteered the Green Mountain Boys as kind of Congress's own regiment. It wasn't associated with the state. But Congress kind of loosely aligned it with New York, but it was under Congress's jurisdiction. Congress said, yes, we'd love to have your support because this aura of might that the Green Mountain Boys had created before the war had carried over. And so they thought they'd be a great fighting unit. They said, you can pick your own officers. They voted, and Ethan Allen says, I'm going to be a shoe-in for this. He's going to be the leader. In fact, he wasn't. By a vote of 41-5, they voted Seth Warner as the regimental commander and just shocked the heck out of Ethan Allen. In fact, they voted as a Lieutenant Ira Allen, one of Ethan Allen's brother, the younger brother. The Green Mountain Boys recognized Warner was the much better military leader.
And just a quick footnote on Ira for those who love trivia. He ended up being the founder of the University of Vermont later on. So, did this create, as I suspect it did, a bit of a schism between Ethan Allen and Seth Warner, or was it just, Ethan took it in stride and went a separate way?
A bit of both. Yeah, Ethan did go a separate way. He ends up becoming an unofficial ambassador to Canada. He went up to Canada trying to recruit Canadians to the American cause. He amassed a group of 60 to 100 people in that effort. Yeah, he made a uninformed assault on Montreal. He thought he could do the same thing to Montreal that he did to Fort Ticonderoga. Unfortunately, the British were waiting for him, and he attacked Montreal and was captured. It wasn't much of a fight. A lot of his Canadians decided they weren't going to fight too hard, so they laid down their arms, and basically it was Ethan and a few people. And the British were just excited to have Ethan captured because of his fame as being the conqueror of Fort Ticonderoga, America's Gibraltar. So they put him in chains and sent him back to England.
He stayed there in jail, if I have it right, for 3 years before he was released in a prisoner swap.
Yes, and he did hard time. I mean, this was not a easy thing. He was in chains. I think it did injure his health. He was never quite as vigorous. It's interesting. On his way back to the United States after that 3 years, he stopped in Cork, Ireland, and he was a folk hero.
Now, while he was incarcerated, Seth Warner is making his name on the battlefield. And while this is, mainly Vermont geography we're going to be talking about, so probably for a Connecticut podcast, don't want to go into too much detail, but there's some things that need to be pointed out here. And he was, starting with Montreal, there were some issues there, and involved was a great British Major General Guy Carleton, and Seth Warner and his troops, he managed to direct them quite bravely, courageously, and strategically during this fight, right?
Yes, he fought the Battle of Longueuil, which was a American victory, one of the few we had in Canada. He also, when the Americans retreated, he led the rear guard action very, very effectively. And of course, Seth Warner's participation in the Battle of Bennington in 1777 is just an outstanding piece of field battle leadership. He came in on the second day of the battle to defeat the British reinforcements, and it really saved the day. I think Seth Warner deserves more credit for his military prowess than he gets. And unfortunately, Ethan Allen is just so much of a folk hero. So much of the limelight goes to him, and a lot of that should go to Seth Warner.
And just to go back to the Battle of Bennington for a moment, because this is one of these aspects that you can look back historically after these battles are fought and understand certain things that maybe weren't understood at the moment, which was namely that because Seth Warner was so successful, I mean, there were 200 British deaths, 700 soldiers captured, and this meant that in the subsequent Battle of Saratoga, which was such a critical part in the Revolutionary War, the victory there by the Americans allowed the French to give their blessing to this effort, and then the French came in, and the rest, of course, is history. But it was because of that Battle of Bennington where Seth Warner made such an impact that the British forces were depleted for Saratoga, right?
Absolutely. And also supplies. Rookies talk strategy and veterans talk logistics. And, the British needed oxen and horses to move their supplies from Canada down to Saratoga. And they were desperately in need of these animals for transportation. And they were at Bennington because that was the storehouse for the Continental Army. And so they were protecting that storehouse. It was a much bigger deal than people think, because if they would have gotten those animals, they could have reinforced their army and potentially would never had Saratoga victory. Seth Warner led a group of people that were not trained military folks. I mean, these were basically farmers, and they knew how to shoot, but they didn't know military drill, and they had no idea how to use cannon. But he was able to do that and defeat a very highly proficient, highly professional army. So it's a big feat.
Now, one footnote, which isn't actually so much a footnote on Ethan Allen, is when he gets out of prison and he comes back, and like you say, he was celebrated in Ireland on the way back, and then he gets back and he's made technically, I think, a general in the Vermont militia, but he wasn't given anybody to command. It was just to give him a title. And he starts getting concerned that he doesn't think the Continental Congress is going to recognize Vermont as an independent territory or colony or state. And so he opens negotiations with his old buddies in Canada. Tell us that chapter of the story.
It's called by historians the Haldeman negotiations. Frederick Haldeman was the governor of Canada at the time. The Canadians and Haldeman thought was that they could entice Vermont over to their side by saying, the Continental Congress isn't recognizing your land grants. We will. If you return to the British Empire and fight for us, we'll recognize your land grants and we'll protect you. Today, you might think, well, geez, that sounds like a pretty stupid thing, and that never happened. But back then, it would, because the British controlled Lake Champlain. And who controlled Lake Champlain? We controlled Vermont. And the British had the ships on Lake Champlain that would control that here. And the British would make forays with their soldiers all the way down to Fort Ticonderoga and Lake George regularly. So Vermont was really under siege by the British, and it was really controlled by the British. So it wasn't a harebrained idea. And these negotiations went on back and forth. They did it under cover of a prisoner swap, in which George Washington hated because he wanted to control the prisoner swaps. So that was against his wishes. And there's a lot of evidence that Allen really wanted to go back to the British Empire, but the British ended up not trusting Ethan Allen. So these things just stalled for a long time. And then once Yorktown happened, the negotiations basically stopped, and Vermont remained outside of British control.
Well, Vermont was finally recognized as the nation's 14th state, but not until 1791. That was a full decade after the end of the Revolutionary War. Ethan Allen, well, he died at age 51 in Vermont. Seth Warner, well, he only lived to be 41. He was buried in his hometown of Roxbury. A monument there in the center of town marks his final resting spot. Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. You know, Seth Warner's final resting place is not without some controversy. Initially, he was buried in the town's historic cemetery, but then they wanted to give him better recognition, so they moved his remains. And when they did, the sword he was supposedly buried with initially was nowhere to be found, and it remains missing to this day. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Gene Procknow, author, historian, and frequent contributor to the Journal of the American Revolution. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, this place features peace and tranquility, probably the freshest jam possible, and one of the best kept mummified body parts in history. Where is it? Well, the answer is Ender's Island off the coast of Mystic. And next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to visit this gorgeous island, which is where a Catholic religious order was bequeathed the property 100 years ago. And yes, we're going to discuss the arm, which is on display, of the patron saint after whom the religious order is named. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.